The geopolitical landscape of the Middle East has been irrevocably altered by a sequence of ballistic events that defied modern interception logic, plunging the region into a state of unprecedented kinetic volatility. It began with a synchronized ignition sequence across several undisclosed launch sites within the Iranian interior, marking the commencement of what military analysts are now calling the most sophisticated saturation strike in the history of localized missile warfare. This was not merely an exchange of fire. It was a calibrated demonstration of strategic reach intended to pierce the most advanced defensive umbrella on the planet. As the first wave of projectiles breached the upper atmosphere, the sheer volume of the telemetry data began to overwhelm early warning nodes, signaling that the theoretical threshold of saturation had finally been reached. The intent was clear: to move beyond the era of asymmetric skirmishes and into the realm of absolute structural defiance, utilizing a tiered arsenal of long-range weaponry that had until this moment existed largely as silhouettes in military parades or data points in intelligence briefings. The scale of this coordinated operation was designed to paralyze the decision-making cycles of regional command centers. Within minutes of the initial detection, the trajectory profiles indicated a multi-vector assault targeting the core pillars of national stability. This was a direct challenge to the concept of total air superiority, as the Iranian High Command unleashed a torrent of ordnance specifically engineered to exploit the inherent latency and automated response systems. The primary objectives were not chosen at random. They represented the vital organs of a modern state. Jerusalem, the political and administrative epicenter, found itself in the crosshairs of a trajectory that challenged the sanctity of its historic and governmental skyline. Simultaneously, the economic engine of Tel Aviv, a city defined by its high-density urban sprawl and global financial connectivity, was bracketed by incoming threats that forced its millions of residents into a desperate subterranean retreat. The coordination required to synchronize these impacts across diverse geographical zones, from the northern industrial corridors of Haifa to the desolate high-security expanses of the Negev, reveals a level of command and control maturity that has caught many international observers off guard. In the Negev region, the stakes were particularly high. This vast desert territory is not merely empty space. It is the repository of the nation's most sensitive strategic assets, including research installations and hardened military infrastructure that serve as the backbone of its defensive posture. By targeting the Negev, the Iranian strike sought to degrade the very capacity for a counter-offensive, aiming for the literal and figurative foundation of the opposition's military strength. The psychological impact of such a broad-spectrum attack cannot be overstated. As sirens wailed in a haunting continuous loop from the Mediterranean coast to the Dead Sea, the reality of the situation became undeniable. The barrier of distance had been dissolved by the physics of modern rocketry. This was a strategic message delivered in the language of fire and kinetic energy, an assertion that no coordinate within the regional map remained beyond the shadow of the Iranian missile program. As the first echoes of the launches reached the international community, the atmosphere within global monitoring stations shifted from routine observation to crisis management. Radar screens across the Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf were suddenly crowded with high-velocity signatures, each representing a potential catastrophe. The speed of the escalation left little room for diplomatic intervention, as the physical reality of the missiles in flight dictated the pace of events. The world watched in real time as the horizon of the Middle East was illuminated by the ascent of solid fuel boosters, marking the end of a period of relative restraint and the beginning of a high-stakes gambit for regional dominance. The technical complexity of the barrage was matched only by its political audacity, signaling a shift in the doctrine of engagement that will be studied by military historians for decades to come. The activation of the multi-layered defensive network was instantaneous. Yet, it faced an architectural challenge of nightmare proportions. This network, a sophisticated tapestry of radar arrays, command and control centers, and interceptor batteries, was designed to handle significant threats. But the sheer density of this specific barrage pushed the system toward a state of terminal stress. As the missiles crossed into the terminal phase of their flight, the sky over major population centers became a chaotic theater of light and sound. The engagement was not a series of isolated incidents, but a continuous interlocking battle between the physics of offense and the algorithms of defense. In the moments before the first impacts, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and the heavy rumble of supersonic transit, a sensory precursor to the destruction that was about to unfold. This was the moment where theory met reality, where the years of investment in missile technology and the decades of preparation for air defense were finally put to the ultimate test in the most public and violent manner imaginable. As the first wave of projectiles pierced the upper atmosphere, the technical reality of the engagement shifted from strategic posturing to a frantic struggle for survival within the command centers of the defense network. This was the moment the multi-layered architecture, a pride of modern engineering, faced the literal breaking point of its processing power. Tracking systems were suddenly flooded with hundreds of high-velocity signatures, each demanding a unique solution for interception. The difficulty lay not just in the volume of incoming fire, but in the qualitative diversity of the threats. Among the descending shapes were the Fatah hypersonic missiles, weapons that redefined the physics of the theater. Capable of speeds exceeding Mach 5 and possessing the ability to maneuver during their terminal descent, these missiles rendered traditional parabolic trajectory calculations obsolete. Instead of a predictable arc, the defense computers were forced to track a shifting, unpredictable target that could dart and weave at speeds that outpaced the mechanical response times of standard interceptor batteries. The reaction window, once measured in minutes, had shrunk to mere seconds. In the hardened bunkers beneath the central districts, the tension was palpable as radar operators watched the Fatah signatures dance across their displays. Traditional air defense relies on the hit-to-kill principle, where an interceptor must physically collide with the incoming warhead. Against a hypersonic glider that is actively avoiding engagement, the probability of a successful kinetic kill drops precipitously. This forced the defensive grid into a state of high-stakes resource allocation, prioritizing targets based on their projected impact points. While the hypersonic threats drew the bulk of the computational focus, the Khorramshahr ballistic missiles were simultaneously plunging toward their marks. These solid-fuel systems, known for their rapid deployment capabilities and high-precision warheads, acted as the heavy hitters of the barrage. Their design minimizes the pre-launch signature, meaning the defensive network had significantly less warning time to prep the mid-range interceptors. The Khorramshahr represents a shift toward more agile, mobile missile forces that can strike with devastating accuracy from deep within sovereign territory, making the task of counter-battery fire nearly impossible. The third pillar of this triad was the Sejil long-range missile, a veteran of the arsenal, but no less lethal for its familiarity. Its solid propellant engines allowed it to reach the upper reaches of the exosphere before arching back down with the force of a falling mountain. The sheer kinetic energy of a Sejil impact is enough to level entire city blocks, even without the chemical payload of its warhead. By launching these three distinct classes of weaponry in a singular coordinated pulse, the planners of the attack created a complexity trap. The defense was forced to fight three different types of wars simultaneously: a high-speed chase against the hypersonics, a precision interception game against the Khorramshahrs, and a brute force stopping action against the Sejils. This saturated the electromagnetic spectrum as well, with dozens of active seekers and radar pings competing for bandwidth in the crowded sky, creating a digital fog of war that further complicated the effort to clear the airspace. On the ground, the sensory experience of this technological clash was overwhelming. Residents in the urban corridors reported a series of rhythmic, chest-thumping booms that signified the departure of interceptor missiles from their silos. These were followed by the eerie, high-pitched whine of incoming ordnance breaking the sound barrier. In Tel Aviv, the sky was transformed into a web of white vapor trails and sudden blinding orange flashes. Each flash represented a gamble. Some were successful interceptions where a warhead was neutralized in the air, while others were the premature detonation of defensive missiles that had lost their lock. Despite the Herculean efforts of the automated systems, the sheer arithmetic of the assault began to favor the aggressor. As the density of the cloud increased, the percentage of successful leakers' missiles that bypassed the shield began to rise. It was no longer a question of whether the shield would hold, but how much damage it could mitigate before the inevitable impacts occurred. In Haifa, the situation took a darker turn as the missiles targeted the industrial heart of the Mediterranean coast. The port, a sprawling complex of cranes, shipping containers, and chemical storage facilities, became a backdrop for a series of thunderous ground strikes. The vibration of the impacts could be felt miles away, rattling the foundations of the historic city. Smoke began to curl upward from the shoreline, a grim indicator that the precision of the Khorramshahr had found its mark among the logistical infrastructure. The targeting of such a vital economic artery was a calculated move to degrade the nation's ability to sustain a long-term conflict. Meanwhile, in the southern expanses of the Negev, the desert floor was lit by the hellish glow of repeated impacts near sensitive military zones. The isolated nature of these facilities meant that news of the damage was slower to filter out, but the seismic sensors across the region told a story of heavy sustained bombardment. The message the Iranian officials had promised was being delivered with tectonic force. carving a new reality into the landscape of the Middle East and signaling that the era of the impenetrable shield had come to a violent, definitive end. The atmosphere in the emergency operations centers across the nation shifted from high-alert coordination to raw crisis management as the first confirmed impacts began to register. In Tel Aviv, the skyline, usually a vibrant tapestry of Mediterranean light and modern glass, was suddenly punctuated by plumes of thick, acrid smoke rising from the heart of the metropolitan district. The structural integrity of the city's dense urban core was put to a terrifying test as the kinetic energy of the incoming warheads translated into localized seismic events. Witnesses on the ground described a sensory overload, the deafening roar of supersonic transit followed by a vacuum-like silence, then a bone-shaking percussion that shattered reinforced windows for blocks in every direction. Rescue teams already positioned in hardened shelters were deployed into a landscape of twisted rebar and pulverized concrete. The fires, fueled by ruptured gas lines and secondary electrical ignitions, began to spread through narrow corridors, challenging the response times of a firefighting force already stretched thin by the sheer number of simultaneous distress calls. In Haifa, the strategic gravity of the situation became even more apparent. The port facilities, which serve as the primary gateway for the nation's maritime commerce, were subjected to a series of precision strikes that appeared to target specific logistical nodes. Massive shipping containers were tossed like children's blocks by the overpressure of the blasts, and the industrial skyline was obscured by a heavy gray curtain of pulverized stone and chemical exhaust. The targeting of these facilities was a deliberate attempt to sever the country's economic umbilical cord. As emergency crews navigated the wreckage of the docks, the complexity of the damage began to emerge. It was not just the physical destruction of the piers and warehouses, but the systematic disruption of the automated systems that managed the flow of goods. The smoke rising from the Haifa Bay area could be seen from miles away, a grim beacon signaling that the conflict had moved into a phase of total infrastructure degradation. The situation in Jerusalem carried a different, more somber weight. The strikes in and around the capital were not just military or logistical calculations. They were strikes at the very heart of the national identity. The psychological shock of hearing air raid sirens over the holy city was followed by the terrifying sight of interceptors streaking through the night sky like falling stars. While many of the incoming threats were successfully neutralized by the upper-tier defense systems, the debris from these mid-air collisions rained down on residential neighborhoods, causing significant secondary damage. Fires broke out in the outskirts of the city, and the administrative district was placed under a total lockdown. The political significance of this targeting cannot be overstated, as it forced a shift in the national psyche from one of guarded security to one of existential vulnerability. The capital, once thought to be a red line that no aggressor would dare cross, was now a theater of active kinetic engagement. Deep in the Negev, the desert became a proving ground for the most advanced elements of the Iranian missile triad. The strikes here were characterized by a terrifying efficiency, aiming for the high-value military installations and research centers that are the bedrock of the country's technological edge. In the vast open expanses, the impact craters were massive, some spanning dozens of meters across, indicating the use of heavy, high-explosive warheads designed for bunker penetration. The isolation of these sites meant that the full extent of the damage remained obscured by military censorship, but the constant stream of medical evacuation helicopters and the glow of fires on the horizon told a story of a fierce and costly engagement. The Negev, which provides the strategic depth for the nation's defense, had been turned into a target-rich environment where the sheer speed of the Fatah hypersonic missiles left little time for personnel to reach hardened cover. As the night wore on, the national emergency infrastructure faced its most grueling trial. The sheer geographic spread of the attacks meant that resources had to be prioritized with cold mathematical precision. In some areas, residents were forced to act as first responders, pulling neighbors from the rubble of apartment complexes while awaiting the arrival of overwhelmed professional units. The digital landscape was equally chaotic as mobile networks struggled under the weight of millions of people attempting to contact loved ones or upload footage of the unfolding destruction. This was a moment of profound national trauma where the technological prowess of the state was seen in a desperate struggle against the raw destructive power of modern rocketry. The images of shattered glass, scorched asphalt, and the tireless work of rescue crews under the glare of emergency floodlights became the defining visual markers of a night that had fundamentally changed the regional security equation. The strategic weight of this offensive has forced a paradigm shift in how global military observers view the feasibility of total national defense. As the dust begins to settle over the scorched asphalt of Tel Aviv and the fractured piers of Haifa, the technical post-mortem reveals a chilling reality. The era of the impenetrable missile shield has been replaced by an era of calculated attrition. Military analysts poring over satellite imagery and telemetry data have noted that the success of the Iranian barrage lay not in the failure of individual interceptors, but in the mathematical exhaustion of the defensive grid. By forcing the multi-layered systems to engage a diverse cocktail of hypersonic gliders and heavy ballistic warheads simultaneously, the attackers effectively bankrupted the defensive processor's ability to prioritize. This realization has sent shockwaves through international defense circles, suggesting that even the most sophisticated kinetic shields can be dismantled through the sheer atmospheric volume of high-velocity ordnance. In the aftermath of the strikes, the humanitarian and economic toll is being meticulously cataloged by emergency task forces operating under a state of total national mobilization. The damage to the Negev's research corridor and the industrial heart of the North represents more than just structural loss. It is a direct blow to the sovereign capacity for long-term technological and logistical endurance. While the political leadership remains in hardened command centers, the public discourse has shifted toward the implications of this new vulnerability. The psychological barrier, the belief that the nation's interior was a sanctuary beyond the reach of conventional regional adversaries, has been structurally compromised. This loss of perceived invulnerability may prove to be the most lasting consequence of the engagement, altering the social and economic behavior of a population that must now reconcile with the reality of a persistent high-precision overhead threat. Iranian officials, meanwhile, have utilized the visibility of the operation to project a narrative of newly minted military parity. By showcasing the operational deployment of the Fatah and Sejil systems in a live combat environment, they have effectively updated their geopolitical resume from a regional power to a transcontinental strike threat. This shift is not merely about the hardware. It is about the demonstration of a command and control hierarchy capable of synchronizing a multi-vector assault across hundreds of miles of hostile airspace. The message to the international community is clear. The technical constraints that once limited the scope of such confrontations have been engineered away. The presence of sophisticated guidance systems and solid fuel propulsion has turned what was once a slow-moving threat into a near-instantaneous strike capability, leaving diplomatic channels with almost no window to de-escalate once the ignition sequence begins. As the smoke clears over the Mediterranean, the focus of the international community has turned toward the potential for a cascading regional escalation. Diplomatic corridors in world capitals are buzzing with the frantic energy of crisis management, as observers wait to see if this barrage was a singular strategic message or the opening salvo of a much larger sustained campaign. The global economy, sensitive to the stability of maritime routes and energy corridors, has already begun to react to the images of the Haifa port in flames. Shipping lanes are being rerouted, and insurance premiums for regional transit have spiked to historic levels, illustrating how a localized missile exchange can rapidly translate into global financial instability. The interconnectedness of modern trade means that a strike on a single port facility in the Middle East vibrates through the boardrooms of London, New York, and Tokyo. In the final assessment, the events reported across Jerusalem, the Negev, and the coastal urban centers serve as a grim blueprint for 21st-century warfare. The traditional boundaries of the battlefield have been erased, replaced by a theater where civilian infrastructure and military installations are indistinguishable in the eyes of a targeting algorithm. As recovery efforts continue and the sirens fall silent, the world is left to contemplate a new and more dangerous equilibrium. The technological genie of hypersonic and high-precision rocketry is out of the bottle, and the old doctrines of deterrence appear increasingly fragile in the face of such raw kinetic power. The full implications of this night of fire will take months, perhaps years, to fully manifest. But the immediate reality is undeniable. The geopolitical landscape has been permanently reshaped by the roar of descending engines and the unforgiving logic of the missile.